Something I've found when it comes to talking about what the best consoles are is that people tend to just say whichever consoles they've owned. It's like saying what your favorite fruit is. Have you ever eaten African horned cucumber before? Never stood a chance. When in reality, we can only assume it wouldn't be able to tap the almighty nanner. And even if we have played a lot of different consoles, sometimes we hate them for weird reasons. I remember back in high school, and I'm not kidding, somebody told me that the GameCube having a handle was all they needed to know it wasn't good. Well, who got the last laugh on that one? This is what makes determining the best consoles so much fun though. A lot of different consoles with a lot of different factors to be considered by a lot of different people with a lot of different experiences. Needless to say, it's endlessly debatable. Try arguing over who the best Teletubby is while you're at it. My vote goes to Lala. But to make this debate a little easier, or harder, depending how you look at it, we're going to focus on which company makes the best consoles overall. Sega, Nintendo, Sony, or Microsoft. Sorry, Atari. If it's any consolation, Xbox probably won't be getting much support anyways. Its best-selling console is the one that would break half the time with Red Ring of Death. Not that sales are necessarily how you determine which console is the best. Now, you're welcome to evaluate this however you want, but the approach I'll be looking at it from could be best described as how good of an experience they offer to the player. And you're going to notice that I offer bonus points for creativity. I feel like right away we should talk about Nintendo, what I suspect will be a very popular answer among all of you, for a variety of reasons. The first being that Nintendo has been around for a really long time. Typically, if something's been around for a while, it's because it must be doing something right. When I cross the street, I always look left, look right, look left again, and look at me. I'm still alive and kicking, baby. But not only has Nintendo been around for a long time, they've put out a ton of consoles during that time, especially when you consider they've had a steady line of both home consoles and handhelds, most of which are very unique from one another. Yep, whereas with something like the Xboxes, you can just toss another black box onto the heap, with Nintendo you've got quite a bit of variety, and not just in terms of how they look, which some could argue doesn't matter at all, but in terms of how they function. I mean, say what you want about Nintendo consoles, good or bad, they've all got personality. The Wii is known for popularizing motion controls. Game Boy is known for popularizing handheld gaming. The DS, I have a 3DS here, but is known for its two screens, and even the Wii U, well, the Wii U is like that one person who shows up to the party and keeps telling jokes that nobody laughs at, doesn't get invited back to any additional parties, gets gossiped about, has all its games stolen, develops a jealousy complex, and then one day you find out it's been dying from neglect. Memory error my butt. It's called dying of a broken heart, folks. That's the thing though, as much as we can appreciate the effort Nintendo puts into making each console different, sometimes it's different in a way that can be viewed as a negative. Nintendo 64, still using cartridges, caused a lot of developers to go with the PlayStation. The GameCube used smaller discs that, despite being pretty darn cute, held less data. And the Wii's motion controls, yeah, a lot of people got sick and tired of them eventually. At the same time, there were still benefits to some of these things. N64 carts meant faster loading. GameCube's small discs meant faster loading. And Wii's motion controls, let's not forget, were really popular for a while and brought a ton of enjoyment to people, some of whom may never have gotten into gaming otherwise. And while a lot of those people may no longer still be into gaming, the optimistic side of me still likes to think that at least some of these some people still are, whether they were kids or not. I mean, it had stuff like Smash Brothers and Mario Kart. Not to mention, Nintendo's mindset of taking chances has resulted in knocking it out of the park at least a few times, and in ways that often change gaming for the better. Most recently, the popularization of hybrid handheld home consoles courtesy of the Switch. Hybrid consoles are just gonna be a thing from now on, like me referencing the joys of looking at floppy-eared dogs. Okay, but now let's talk about Sega. The thing Sega immediately has working against it when it comes to making home consoles is that they no longer do. Forget looking left, looking right, and looking left again. Sega just walked into the middle of the street without looking at all and then stopped to do the Macarena. Some of their hardware just didn't feel like it was thought through all the way. However, working in Sega's favor is that they did still make some consoles that are very beloved by fans. I mean, I've always maintained the opinion that Sega's failure was due to poor business decisions more than anything else, and not because they didn't know how to make great video games, which most people would tell you is the most important thing. And hey, you know what? Some people don't consider things like the 32X to be consoles, they consider them add-ons, in which case they don't count for this discussion, and Sega is back in business, baby. But yeah, I don't think I can give them a pass for that. I can give them a pass for the Saturn, though, a console that was considered a commercial failure back in the day outside of Japan, but nowadays has a very dedicated fan base for those who have given it a fair chance, many of whom didn't give it a fair chance when it first came out. What I'll always give Sega a lot of credit for is building consoles that had an identity tied to Sega itself. Games on Sega consoles, more often than not, felt like Sega games, a big part of why I believe Sega just hasn't been the same since they stopped having their own console. Sega made a lot of great games themselves, which set the tone for how other developers would develop games on a Sega console. Some of my go-to examples of this are Castlevania Bloodlines and Contra Hard Corps for the Genesis. These had a decidedly different feel from the Super Nintendo games, with words like Bloodlines and Hardcore matching the games themselves that went for a more gritty, action-heavy approach. And look what they did with Aladdin, adding in a sword to the game to give it that special Genesis feel. The exact opposite of all this is the big issue I have with some of Sony and Microsoft's consoles. They often feel more like interchangeable devices that aren't doing enough to be different from each other, with an emphasis on compiling powerful hardware parts on the inside. Kind of like PCs, which, funny enough, if you look at the hardware inside of more recent PlayStation and Xbox consoles, especially starting with the PS4 and Xbox One, they're resembling PCs and refrigerators more and more. For some people, this is what a video game platform should be, though. Just make the specs strong enough that the devs have as much power as they need, and then get out of the way and let them do their thing. Certainly effective, but hardly what I would call innovative. And yeah, I know there's things like the PS5's adaptive triggers and PlayStation VR that has some people jazzed up, but the impact of stuff like that feels minimal, especially since PSVR isn't the only way, nor the first way, that you can do VR. Something I actually do think is really cool that nobody seems to talk about for some reason is the fact that PS5 has an air purifying function. That said, it's important that developers have avenues they can go to with their games. Something Sony has traditionally done a good job of, something Nintendo hasn't always been good at due to how they handle business, and that Sega hasn't always been able to do because, well, they don't even have consoles to put games on anymore, do they? Sony has been great about having tons of developers get on board with its systems, even despite some of their consoles being hard to develop for, like the PS3 and, yes, even the PS2, surprising for some to hear given how well that console did. But I'd also say Sony's done a good job of slowly building up a catalog of exclusive IPs over the years, even if some of them are second-party or third-party studios making the games, and a lot of them are showing up on PC. But they've done a much better job than Microsoft has done, in my opinion. And speaking of Microsoft and the Xbox, I haven't talked about it much because I feel safe in assuming that while some people may choose it, I mean, I get it, Xbox Live was a big deal, Game Pass, Phil Spencer wore a Battletoads shirt one time, but it's not going to be the most popular answer here or really anywhere you'd have this discussion, except for maybe like an Xbox forum. If you want to hear what you want to hear, there's always a place you can go to hear it, and I have found my people. The thing is, I actually like Xbox a lot more than most of the people who make fun of it. Is that a compliment? But yeah, I've spent a lot of time playing and enjoying Xbox over the years. Alright, but now it's winner picking time. Who gets a rose? Sorry, my wife watches Bachelor, and I may or may not have my ways of sneaking a peek. But I'd say that Sony and Nintendo get the nod for having done it as long and as well as they have. And believe me, I actually like Sega more than Sony from a personal standpoint, but I think giving it to Sony is the more fair answer. There's just way too many good games that have accumulated on their consoles over the years. But then again, Rocket Knight Adventures is a Genesis game for Sega, so maybe it does go to Sega. But if I were to choose between Sony and Nintendo, I'd give Nintendo the edge overall, since Sony started to go more the route of generic PC in a black box disguised as a console. Speaking of which, I made my own console. Who wants to put down a pre-order? It can do amazing things. But with all that said, you have my choice. Now it's time to hear what your choice would be. And just a suggestion, you can explain your answer without calling me an idiot. Not that I'm necessarily against that sentiment, but either way, I promise I will hear you out and look forward to doing so. So with that, leave your comment down below and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's